Everyone, this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's video I'm going to be doing essentially a book review of a book that I recently purchased, and I'll explain in just a second why I was able to get my hands on this book and for what reason I had it. So essentially, the book is what you see here. It's called Mכשירי חשמל בשבת, פסקי הלכה, and it's by Rabbi Yisrael Meir Irum. And essentially, what this book is, and just so you know, it's a book in Hebrew. So if you can't read Hebrew, this is not going to be as much relevant to you. But for those of you who read Hebrew, this is actually a good book. I got my copy from this bookstore here in Jerusalem called Otzar Hasfarim, and essentially the book goes through and deals with what are the halakhic implications of basically when it comes to Shabbat and using electrical devices. Now, as an electrical engineer, this is something that I really had been looking for a while, something that actually deals with what the halakha says about all the foundational issues that allows us to make the decisions that are made about electricity on Shabbat. Because obviously, when the Torah was given, nobody had industrial electricity as far as we know, for example, which means that they didn't have it essentially. But the thing is, in the Torah itself, it specifically gives the reasonings needed and the infrastructure that's needed to make future judicial rulings, when the Jewish community needs it. What that means is that, for example, as things progress, technology changes, new technologies are invented, we have to see, based on the Torah, as our foundation, how do we actually, operate within these changes? So as an example, at one point there was no industrialized electricity, and then all of a sudden there is. Well, this brings up the question of, okay, well, what's permissible on Shabbat? What's not permissible when it comes to these, this industrialized electricity? Now we have electronic devices that are all over the place. What is permissible, what is not permissible, and for what reasons and what conclusions, and how do we, gain conclusions from this? Now, the reason this topic really came up for me personally was that there's a forum that I've mentioned before in other videos that I'm on. I've kind of backed away from it quite a bit lately, but recently there was a person on the forum who was making statements about halakha and the Talmud, and some of the statements they were making were kind of like all over the place, as if really what they were trying to get at was they were trying to really talk bad about Jews in general, even though the person themselves was Jewish. And one of the things they mention concerning the Talmud and concerning judicial rulings that have been made specifically about electricity and Shabbat is they kept saying that that the rabbis had spurious reasoning when they made some of these judicial rulings. Now, if when I looked into it, I was like, well, what exactly does that mean? Because they didn't go into a lot of detail of something to describe exactly what they mean in detail. They just kind of threw out there a couple of issues. That, in my personal opinion, if you really look into them, you know that it contradicts what the meaning of it is. And basically, what I found on the internet is that spurious reasoning is often termed specious reasoning or specious reasoning. And essentially, it's like an argument that appears plausible, logical, or true on the surface, but are actually based on false premises, invalid inferences, and misleading information. So this person never went into detail about, anything in very specific detail about specifically about Shabbat. But one of the things they kept claiming was that the idea that supposedly the rabbis thought, okay, well, electricity is fire, and therefore we should say it's not it's forbidden on Shabbat. Now this claim is false, and I did a video about how false this claim is, because the question isn't really like whether or not the rabbis who made the rulings that they were made, were trying to say that electricity is like fire. It has nothing to do with that whatsoever. The issue is, okay, what is the word ma'vir, which is used in Torah, and how does that apply to ish, which is how you would translate fire, and how does that is there any way that that can be applied to chashmal? That's what you would say in English. And then the word ma'vir is usually translated as kind of like kindling a fire. And there are some people who try to make the claim, as I mentioned in the previous video I did about this, that well, making a fire took a lot of work. But as I showed in the video, well, if you prepare for 6 days out of the week and get everything ready, and then like let's say on Shabbat you want to light a fire and it only takes you 2 seconds to do it, it's still forbidden on Shabbat because of the word ma'vir, which means that the minute that I try to kindle that fire, that's what is being made, forbidden on the Torah, not specifically that I have a fire somewhere. So for example, when it comes to like Jews who hold by Torath Mosheh or Orthodox Jews, if a fire is started before Shabbat, and it's running on Shabbat and you don't do anything to it to like increase it or decrease it, you can make use of it. So for example, let's say I've got food that I prepared for Shabbat, before the Sabbath, and I basically put that food on top of a fire that was running before the Sabbath. I can use that food. I can eat that food. Now there's restrictions about how we do certain things. For example, whether a person can take off, like let's say something that has water or liquids in it, put it back or take it off. There are regulations about that, which the Torah commands us to make regulations about how we manage these things. But it's not forbidden to have a fire running on the Sabbath that was started before the Sabbath. It's just simply something that's regulated, like with anything else, because the Torah is a national, social, and political legal system that the creator of all things gave to the Jewish people. And that was one of the things that was strange, because this person who made this claim about the rabbis using spurious reasoning was that they were talking in a way as if they were trying to say, well, this goes against the spirit of the Torah. But then when you look at what they claim that they believed, at one point they were saying that they were an agnostic, and it was like, well, wait a minute, how can you be agnostic and make this argument? Because it would seem to stand to reason that the whole Torah would be a problem to you if that's the case. And, you can't say, well, it's against the spirit of the Torah when the Torah itself specifically says there has to be a judicial system. And the reason why that's important is because the book that I'm basically going to be reviewing that I showed earlier deals with the issue of, okay, when we deal with like what's forbidden on Shabbat in terms of electricity and what's permissible, how do we get to the reasoning and how do we get to the understanding of it? So essentially, this is the book itself. Again, it's in Hebrew. So if you're looking for something in English, you won't be able to like, find it in this book because this book is in Hebrew. Basically, it's not like a huge, it's not like a long book. The first picture actually makes it looks longer than it is, but essentially, it's a pretty easy read in Hebrew. And one of the things that I liked about it, and it's got like what you see in the beginning that you're seeing here are all of the approvals that different rabbis have made by looking and reading the book and agreeing with it. But one of the things I really liked about it is it starts off by giving the foundations of how we exactly understand the issues that are going to be talked about in the book. Meaning that it isn't like a book, and halakha doesn't, for example, say, electricity is fire, therefore you can't use, electricity. That's not at all what happens. What this book does, it says that for every, element, for every different type of device that uses electricity, we have to take it upon it, we have to take it by case scenario. Meaning that I can't take a refrigerator and equate that to a cellular phone. They're two different, like, things. So I have to take each one at its own like merit, and then we apply the halakhic process. So one of the things that's cool about this book, especially being an engineer, it has like descriptions of different devices, shows you pictures of what the issues are in relation to the halakha, and then from there explains the different rulings that were made on it and why they were made. Which goes against this idea of like spurious reasoning, because when you're dealing with spurious reasoning, someone's like making like wrong decisions based upon bad information. Well, as an electrical engineer, I read through, I haven't finished the book yet, but I've read through many parts of it, and it's not making spurious reasoning at all. It's based upon sound electrical reasoning, and most important, most of the issues when it comes to electronics are not about the issue of thinking that you're starting a fire. Not the electricity itself is the problem. The basic issue is other areas of halakha that deal with, for example, like, let's say when you turn on the circuit and you're like closing and opening different like switches in the circuit, as well as, what happens when you have like a current flowing through a circuit and it begins to heat up certain elements. So essentially what it does is this book goes by case and explains exactly how the particular, device works, what exactly is happening inside of it electronically, and different things like that. And then it goes through and says, okay, well, these are the different, views in terms of the halakha on it. And again, these are all rulings that were made because of the fact that these devices didn't exist when the Torah was given. So now that they do exist and now that they've been created, the judicial system has to go through and say, okay, well, how do we, what's permissible to use and what's not permissible to use? What happens if I use the device in this way on the Shabbat, on the Sabbath, for example? I mean, good example, it deals with refrigerators. What are the issues when I have a digital refrigerator? What are the issues when I have a refrigerator that's not digital? What exactly am I activating by turning on a refrigerator? As an example, it goes to the issue of, okay, well, some refrigerators have fans in them. And then some refrigerators create the cold inside of them by activating a chemical process, essentially. And then from there, you also have the issue of like the light that turns on. So there are, for example, are refrigerators that are specifically made for Shabbat, or for the Sabbath, where you essentially turn on a switch before the Sabbath, and then it keeps the refrigerator in a constant state of just, like regular cooling without activating the light. And it doesn't act, it doesn't change if you open the door, close the door. And essentially that, you can set it like the one I have, it sets for like, I think, essentially like more than 24 hours, probably about like 30 or 40 hours, I think. And then when the Sabbath is over, you just turn that setting off. And then there's another setting where if you have like, let's say, 2 or 3 days, for the Chagim, essentially it allows you to like set that for that period of time. So one of the things I think sometimes people get confused with is that they think, okay, well, like Jews who hold by the Torah are stuck within this like, primitive, almost like this one guy called like Iron Age kind of like thinking. Like, no, we don't think like, okay, well, just because 1,000 years ago they didn't have refrigerators, therefore I can't have one either. No, it's like, okay, now that they've invented a refrigerator, it makes keeping food, cool on the Shabbat easier than it would have been 1,000 years ago, so we can make use of it. But of course, we have to understand how does it work. And a good example and this is the reason why I really went after this book when I saw it. I was at a synagogue not too long ago, about 2 Shabbats ago, and I was talking about this particular issue. Came up with this person challenging the rulings that were made by the rabbis, and specifically just the person seemed to challenge in a way where they didn't seem to understand the rulings themselves. It just I got the impression that they were just angry about something else, and it was just like the rulings that are made and the Jewish community were kind of in their target, as a basic way to kind of express their problem with something else. And I was talking to a guy at the synagogue that I was visiting, and I was looking at the clock. I was like, wait, the clock says 4 o'clock. Did I get here too early? It's like supposed to be 7 when I got here. He was like, no, the clock's wrong. And he was like, well, we can't. And I was like, yeah, okay, we can't. You can't really change it on Shabbat. And we were having a discussion. Can you like adjust the clock on Shabbat? It was like a mechanical clock. And I said, like, in principle, you might be able to, but the first thing is that according to halakha, you'd have to know how it works, because we know that, for example, there are 39 things that are called malakha. In the Torah mentions that we are forbidden from doing malakha on Shabbat in order to have oneg Shabbat, in order to separate ourselves from the things we do during the week. And malakha has a very specific meaning. Malakha doesn't mean just work, because anything could be considered work. There's 39 categories of what's considered malakha. And then there are things that we can derive from those 39 categories, depending on the circumstances, depending on how things advance in future times. So the thing I said was that in principle, you might be able to, to adjust that clock, but first you'd have to know exactly what all of the halachot are, what the different 39 malachot are, and if there are some derivatives of them that could be affected by you manipulating the clock. And then also you have to understand that specific clock. How does it work? Is there maybe some element inside of it that by changing it, you're activating something that you didn't think was there. And I said that that's where we'd have to go through and discuss it. And that's the way that this book approaches, and that's the way halakha is approached. That essentially it wasn't like the rabbi sat down and said, okay, electricity is fire, therefore it's forbidden. That's not even the issue, because fire is not really forbidden. It's the issue of the Torah says maf'ir, which is to do the active process of doing something with the fire. So for example, one of the issues of ma'vir, as I mentioned in the video I did about this, is that ma'vir can also be something that where you're affecting a change in temperature on a particular device. So you can make something into a heating device, and you could be considered the word in Hebrew ma'vir to be affecting that. Where if the person just says, well, it's forbidden to have fire on Shabbat, well, there's nothing the Torah says it's forbidden to have a fire. It just says that ma'vir in terms of fire is the issue. So the same issue could apply to electricity, that you have an issue of ma'vir, because as I mentioned before, and anyone who knows electroengineering would know this, that when you complete a circuit, for example, you can have a situation where elements in the circuit begin to heat up because of the fact that you have current flowing through it. And that's where the understanding of how these things work is very important. And that's what I liked about what I've read through this book so far, where it gives you a foundation, and it doesn't go in and say, okay, well, electricity is forbidden because it's fire. It doesn't say anything like that at all, because that's not what the rabbis were looking at. And again, I would only assume that someone who would say that doesn't really know halakha, and doesn't even maybe know Hebrew. Even if the person was Jewish who mentioned this, one point during this, when they first brought these challenges up, and I was kind of discussing the challenges, at one point they were saying, well, you don't even understand what I'm getting at. And I was like, well, I've read everything you wrote, and I'm responding specifically to everything you wrote. If you would like to expand upon what you're saying, then I'd be more willing to discuss that, but the person wouldn't do it. And then there was even a person who wasn't let's say Orthodox, they were maybe Reformed conservative, who was trying to say like, okay, well, you're not listening to the person. I'm like, but I'm listening. I read, I'm just reading, but I read everything they wrote and I've responded to it and I've done it respectfully. I don't think that what they're bringing up is really the issue. I think something else is really the issue. Um, and eventually later on, the person wrote more stuff where this person that was trying to defend them actually came out and said well, like something against them also because of just the way they were writing things. But again, the bigger issue is that when it comes to halakha, you know, the thing is, I really like books like this, and this is where I think that there's a big advantage to knowing, specifically the details there. So again, going back to this book in particular, I would rate this book very highly. I mean, I guess on a scale of like 1 to 5, I would basically rate it as a 5 or a 6. And again, it's because of the fact that just like with any book on halakha, it goes through the foundations of what it's talking about. I could tell that the person, or the authors of it, had an understanding of the different issues related to each different electrical device or product that they were discussing, and they brought down the sources that were necessary. And this is one of the books I like having on my bookshelf because sometimes questions like this do come up, and especially as an electrical engineer, it actually helps me in the area that I'm in terms of dealing with electrical power and things like that. To have something like this that is Torah based, it's in Hebrew, so it's clear to understand what the real issues are. Um, and and that's why I said, because I personally think that when people bring up these issues against the Torah and against halakha, it's often because they're reading something in translation. I mean, I've seen that a lot in the English speaking world. Well, they'll say something in translation, and it's like, okay, well, the Hebrew is not, you can't fully translate the Hebrew that way. And again, I'm kind of like a broken record. The idea that some people have where they think, okay, well, the rabbis sat down and said, you know, electricity must be fire, therefore, fire, electricity is forbidden on Shabbat. And that's just not the reality. Especially someone who knows Hebrew would know, and this book even mentions it, is that in certain devices, the issue is mavir, not whether it's fire or, even the electricity itself. It's the issue of what happens when you activate it. What is actually going on when you activate electricity. So therefore, it's like, okay, if you activate it before Shabbat and it's acting in this way in Shabbat, okay, that's permissible. But if you activate this other particular thing on Shabbat or before Shabbat, and it's doing these kind of things on Shabbat, then that thing is not permissible. And the reasons come from the 39, um, different things that are considered malakha. So there's a lot of areas of the book where it discusses that in some of the devices, the issue is not even like whether or not it's mavir, that it's specifically that it's boneh or soter, which basically means that by turning it on and off, that's like, two other like elements of the 39 malachot that, person's doing, which deals with, like in English, you translate as building and taking apart. But basically, boneh and soter in this instance could also be, made, by activating. And again, one of the things that I think is really important that this book also shows is that the rabbis who made these rulings for the communities that hold by the Torah, and research these things, that they were basic not on, they weren't based on like a lack of understanding of engineering. Because I'm telling you, I'm an electrical engineer. I read it, and essentially, I know the person who wrote this had an understanding of how the engineering works. So that's why I can tell you right now, it's not spurious reasoning. And it's everything that makes sense. So it comes down to, like, at some point the Torah tells us that the judges have to make a ruling. And we go by their rulings because that's what Hashem, commanded. We're not, commanded, for example, to go out and just challenge every little thing because I don't like the fact that someone, who's in a position of power that we democratically voted to be in that position made a ruling and I don't want to listen to it. Because at some point, and I'll be honest with this, the people who sometimes challenge halakha almost to me sometimes sound like sovereign citizens. Sovereign citizens. And for those who don't know, sovereign citizens are a type of people who basically believe that they have the right to kind of do, on some level, whatever they want, and that no government can tell them to do, certain things. So one of the famous tropes of sovereign citizens is to, like, let's say, get in a car and say, I don't need to have registration on my car, and I don't need to have a driver's license, and a police officer can't pull me over because, I have the right to travel. When in American law, the right to travel means that, yeah, you can get on your feet and walk anywhere you want, and a state can't stop you from crossing their border and walking into their state, for example, or traveling. But what they can do is they can regulate how you travel, on a road, or how you drive on a road, because the minute you get into a car, well, that's like, as one guy said, it's like a huge death machine. essentially, you can cause an accident that can hurt people or kill people. So, and because also the roadways, need regulation, the roadways are something they can regulate. They can regulate how you travel on it, but you have the right to travel. You just simply have to follow the rules of the law of the land, if you will. So I get the same sense with halakha, that there's some people sometimes who take this, kind of sovereign citizen kind of approach to halakha, where often with the sovereign citizens, they don't do real research. And if they did, they would know, okay, well, I can't just I can't print out like a license plate and stick it on my car and then like not have insurance and not have a driver's license. And then if something happens to me, I expect the law to work in my favor. Of course that doesn't work that way. No society works that way. Um, so this is what I loved about this book. And again, I know I'm kind of going in different angles when describing it, but I think that this is a book that if you know Hebrew and you want to understand, the issues of, what, particular items, electronics, items and things like that, why certain ones are regulated on Shabbat, why certain ones are forbidden on Shabbat, and what the process the rabbis went through to come to these conclusions. And I think this is a very important book for that. So this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and I hope that everything's working well for you. And again, if you are looking for this book, you can find it at this bookstore, Otzar Sfarim. And for those who speak English, I'm sorry, but unfortunately, I don't know of an English version of this book. Okay, so take care and bye.